Hello and welcome to today's Menlo Park podcast episode. We're moving slightly away from the normal series of illuminating primary care. We're actually going to be starting a new series with the help of Thomas Tallis, the leader of our new division. This episode is going to be all about introducing you to that new sector that we're going to be looking at, the new series we're going to be starting that is called Ticket to Oz, GP's Guide to Working and Living in Australia. Now, the purpose of this entire podcast today is going to be providing a touch on key topics on what working and living in Australia is like for GPs. We want to basically put the word out there, get some information out there so that people can get more information about this. We want to ask everybody to kind of check out our social pages that we're going to be on. We've got Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. We're also on the main things like LinkedIn. For people to find out a little bit more about future episodes in the podcast. Each of them is going to delve into different topics to make the whole thing about moving to Australia much more manageable. And Thomas will talk you through each of those. I'd advise our listeners as well to stick around until the end of this episode because we'll be covering some bits you don't want to miss. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the sector leader, Thomas Tallis. So Thomas, if you could give some background about yourself to our listeners, please. And thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ciaran. Hi, everyone. As Ciaran has already said, I'm Thomas. I've been in international recruitment now for the best part of 4 years, working specifically within Australia, and obviously been dealing with an awful lot of different healthcare sectors, which has been great. In regards to work in Australia, it's allowed me to build up a lot of good relationships and a lot of good relationships with practices and different clients that are over there, which is also always good. Always great to obviously be able to develop your kind of knowledge, work with these people, and obviously learn from them at the same time as well. In regards to working with GPs, it's something that I've very experienced with. I've actually been helping a numerous amount of GPs move into Australia, which is great. So I know the system incredibly well, and looking forward to being able to guide a lot more of them into Australia.
Awesome. Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me again today, Thomas, as I say. Um, so, to give our listeners a bit of background, it's no secret that there are a lot of challenges within the healthcare system here in the UK currently, whether that's staffing, funding, financial pressures. There's large backlogs, long wait times, and the infrastructure as a whole, I think to say it could do with some attention would be an understatement. Um, so, highlighting these issues, I think, is really important, as you and I have discussed prior to recording today's episode, Thomas. And whether that's salaries, finding work, work-life balance, there's factors as well with people's health, like burnout, their own well-being, progression and growth comes into the factors as well. And I think, unfortunately, we do speak to a lot of GPs who do feel undervalued, and hence why there is such a big effort and a big amount of people looking at moving actually out to Australia and changing all that side of things. And there has been that change in the market geographically because of that. So what I'm going to do for our listeners' benefit, I'm going to just mention a few things to Thomas, and he's going to kind of lead answering kind of, let's say, some frequently asked questions, that sort of thing. So without further ado, Thomas, can you give our listeners some examples of some reasons as to why GPs are actually considering a move overseas into Australia specifically?
Yeah, I guess you've mentioned a couple there, but I guess some of the biggest benefits that we've got and motives, if you will, really are things like the earning abilities. GPs over in Australia, earnings can vary. It does vary depending on the individual, the practice, but also obviously the individual's ability and dedication. But GPs that have got special interests, GPs that are motivated, wanting to try and really kind of excel, they can earn an incredible amount of money over there. GPs here in the UK, a lot of them are working way over 40 hours. So when you think about Australia, that would get classed into the out of hours side of things if they started doing anywhere near the amount of hours that they're doing. And typically that would end up seeing GPs earning realistically around 300, well, between 300 and 600,000 Australian dollars, per year, which is crazy in the grand scheme of things. That
Yeah,
that kind of works out anywhere between about 157, give or take, and 310,000 British pounds, and obviously depending on the conversion. Which
not
it's
to
no,
be sniffed at, is it?
yeah, it's a bit of a no-brainer when you think about it from that respect. The main thing with the earnings that's probably the difference for GPs is that rather than it being a set salary, it does work out more on a percentage basis. So it's a percentage cut between them and the practice. But even still, you tend to see as a GP anywhere between around 60 and 70%, going to yourself. The additional 40 or 30 would then go to the GP practice or the medical centre, purely just to keep it open. Obviously, that's then for obviously the equipment and things, and obviously the running cost of the overall practice. Taking away from or going away from the earning ability, as I mentioned, that well, as you mentioned, that work-life balance. So typically for a GP, they will be making anywhere, or they will be doing anything between full-time equivalent is 38 to 40 hours a week.
Mhm.
So very good, work-life balance in comparison to a lot of GPs here in the UK that we speak to. Allowing them to obviously spend time with the loved ones, with the family, but obviously enjoy that lifestyle that Australia's got to give. Being in that sunshine, being on those beaches, being around some of those national parks and lakes and things,
Yeah.
which kind of knocks on to the next benefit, I guess, of the of that quality of life. And I know you've already briefly mentioned it, but the Australian quality of life is undoubtedly the one of the best in the UK.
Well, they're renowned for it, aren't they?
Yeah,
They're
they
well known
certainly
for
are.
it.
They certainly are, and I guess it's that aspect as we've already mentioned, living in the sunshine. Having what best part of 300 days, 3,000 hours worth of sunshine. It certainly plays a part. I know myself that when you're driving to work on a sunny day, or you wake up and you see the sun shining, you feel a lot better than you do if it's a miserable, grey,
Mm.
gloomy day that we have quite often here here in the UK. On top of that, they've got great living standards. So I think there was actually one of their cities, Canberra, which is their capital city, has recently been ranked the second best city in the not just in Australia but in the world for quality of life,
Wow.
which is yeah ridiculous. It's crazy, and it's obviously appealing to a lot of people. It draws a lot of people in for that reason,
Mm.
which is a no-brainer. Really is a no-brainer. And without kind of going through every single benefit that there is, I do want people to still be able to reach out. But you have mentioned obviously about that, appreciation, and people being a little bit undervalued here in the
Mm.
UK, which again is another factor that we hear of an awful lot.
Yeah, all too
And
much, unfortunately.
exactly, and in Australia, they recognise GPs as a vital role within the healthcare system. So it really is one of those which you're working with the practice, as you've been able to tell, it works on a partnership kind of basis on that percentage. So you are, appreciated by the practice, and it's all around, providing an accessible and high patient care for individuals and for the local communities.
Mm.
GPs are, acknowledged for their expertise, their appreciation, their dedication, and obviously contributing towards a healthcare system, whilst working within this healthcare system in Australia, which is we've always said, renowned. Great quality of care. Very, very, very patient centred, as we mentioned, and the Australian healthcare system is one of the best across the globe for the
Mm.
way that it operates, which again provides that better work-life balance, quality of life, and everything just kind of leads into one, which I guess is very appealing for a lot of GPs at this very moment in time.
Mm. Not being an expert myself, Thomas, I'll just ask as well for our listeners' benefit. Is the Australian healthcare system purely private? It's not like the NHS, is it?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
So it's purely private and privatised. It's all well, the majority of it is done through something called Medicare. So Medicare was introduced into Australia in the early 1900s. So something that they don't, Australians don't blink an eyelid at. They've got obviously very, very well, very, very covered. It comes out of their salaries or national insurance, if you will, on the equivalent to their national insurance, and it's not something that they are hugely out of pocket on. It does depend on the Medicare cover that they've got. It depends on the practice that they go to. There are a variety of different practices by way of bulk billing or mixed billing, for example. So it does vary obviously on that standpoint. But individuals aren't really out of pocket. It is one of
Yeah.
those which obviously does work in the patients and the GP's best interest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you say, the quality of life and such, they must be doing something right with the healthcare system. 'Cause you never really hear about complaints of complaints about it, do you? Like you
N-
get all too often over here, unfortunately.
No, no, exactly, exactly. You do it wrong. It is one of those. You're never going to find that anyone is everyone finds everything perfect.
Yeah.
I'm never going to turn around and say that, you're going to go to something that's just going to be, absolutely, perfect, but perfect
Mm,
doesn't exist. It's one of those, someone's always going to find something to complain about, whether they've got the best of the best. So,
yeah. Excellent, excellent. So, thank you for covering that part, Thomas. So, another thing that I wanted to ask was Australia. At the moment, I think it's no secret that they are really keen to get UK GPs specifically. Um, why is it that you're finding so many UK GPs specifically wanting to explore Australia, and what attracts Australia to our UK GPs?
yeah, I guess as we mentioned, some of those benefits that we've already said there about the work life balance, the weather, the appreciation side of things, I think is very appealing to an awful lot of people.
Mm,
But I think ultimately, part of the fact that the healthcare system is so good, GPs can actually work within these same state of the art medical centres. So rather than it being a GP practice like we have here in the UK, it is what we call kind of medical centres.
mm,
They are state of the art, they're highly invested into, which means that they've got a wide variety of different technology. It allows people to then obviously develop their skill sets as well, because a lot of the practices themselves will have a lot of services that they don't offer here in the UK. So in-house imaging, things like radiology, things like pathology, minor surgery, for example. There's allied health in the room next door, and I've even had it before where you've had blood results that have been taken and returned within the space of a couple of hours. Maybe 1 or 2 hours,
wow.
which is unheard of. We don't get that here in the UK. So
Yeah.
it gives people that, or GPs, that aspect of really being able to kind of advance in their career on top of the additional benefits that we've mentioned. But really does obviously appeal to an awful lot of people having that cutting edge technology,
Mm.
literally at their fingertips.
Yeah, excellent. And from the work that you've been doing over the past few years, Thomas, have you got any insights from GPs who have made that move?
Yeah, so I guess obviously the best insights that I've really had, people, GPs always ask me, is it really as good as they say? And a lot of people say to me, the answer I suppose to that is that yes it is. Yeah, it really is as good as obviously it says. The only catch, people say to me a lot, what's the catch, Thomas? And the only catch is that it's halfway around the world.
Mm,
That is the only catch. By way of the system itself, it's a very very advanced system. GPs have got the ability to advance their lives ultimately and their families' lives. Putting a lot more money away. Living obviously in fancy houses, driving fancy cars, putting the kids into private school. So it really is as good as people say, as I keep on mentioning. And the majority of them don't actually come back to the UK. It's funny how many GPs will turn around to me and say, "Okay, well, Thomas, I'll maybe go for a year. I'll maybe go for 2 years." And 5 years down the line, they're
they're
still they're
still
still
there.
there. They don't want to come back. As soon as
Yeah.
they've had a taste for it and they've experienced really how good it is, yeah, they don't want to come back. Other than family, they come back on holidays. They
Mm,
can potentially try and keep things like um, their register here, obviously in the UK, but the majority of them decide just to stay in Australia, and I really don't blame them. Like I say, it's just being valued for what you do, having that old school respect,
yeah.
for GPs, and yeah, it really is just like I keep on saying, it's as good as you keep on hearing,
Mm.
and that's why a lot of people keep on going.
Well, going off what you've said there as well, Thomas, about obviously being halfway around the world, plane tickets aren't cheap, so I suppose people won't come back too often. But what other practical considerations are there in comparison to the UK?
Yeah, so in regards to practicality side of things, you still do get your annual leave, you still do get holidays, so you can still come back and see friends, see families. Your friends and families can also fly over to Australia. Just like you say, the tickets aren't the cheapest.
Mm.
It's not the quickest of flights. It's not like you can just jump in your car or jump on a plane and be there an hour later. But practicality wise, just like we are saying about obviously the schooling, about obviously families and things like this, you are ultimately being able to put yourself in a much better kind of life
Mm.
and lifestyle.
Excellent, excellent. And in terms of anything else that you think is worth our listeners hearing about or benefiting from? Is there anything additional, whether it's kind of commonly asked questions that you have when you have conversations with people or with practices, anything like that?
Yeah, so I guess obviously, common thing that comes up is the cost of living side of things. So, the cost of living in, if you were to compare the cost of living in Australia to somewhere like the UK, whilst purchasing, houses and groceries at times can visually look more expensive. You've got to bear in mind that we're talking about an Australian dollar to the pound, but visually things do look a little bit more expensive, but in the grand scheme of things, you're earning a lot more. So it is one of those. It does cover people. It does kind of cover people in that respect. People are having a lot more ability to kind of save up and obviously add savings. We've got doctors that we've placed in the past that are earning like I say, multiple six figures. They're buying six-figure houses. They're driving around in flash fancy cars, and GPs are in Australia are in that top 1% of earners. Just to throw that one out there as well. So
Wow.
it's not like they are as we've been saying, undervalued. They do have this element of a bit more of a disposable income, shall we say, from that respect. And another side of things that comes up quite a lot is the registration. How do we do things like the registration? How do we do things like the visa side of things? And that's something that I've got experience with. It's something that I can guide you through, step by step. Something that I'm happy to, provide my knowledge and my experience on. I always have to say to everybody, and I always do say to every GP, I'm not a visa agent, unfortunately, but I have been in the industry for long enough now, working with different visas, that I can give my assistance where possible. But anything that I can assist with, we can put you in touch with the visa agent that we've got,
Hmm.
who obviously can give you all the assistance and guidance that's required. Um, in regards to the registration itself, I will throw it out there that the registration, does come at a cost. Just like everything in life, you have to, spend money to accumulate
Yeah.
money, but that is broken down into stages. So it's not something that, people tend to say, is it something that they pay all at once? How are they going to fund something like that, all at once? And it's broken down. So the registration can take time. It does take realistically best part of kind of 9 months to actually complete the registration. To make the move, I tend to say to people, let's settle affairs as well. So, let's give ourselves best part of a year or even a bit longer if required. And you can break down that registration cost across that space of that year. And
Mm.
in the meantime, if they are struggling for work, that's obviously where, it's like yourself, Kieran, come into
Hmm.
place. And,
Yeah.
could find them obviously, some great jobs here in the UK to obviously help kind of fund that, in the meantime. Um, but yeah, in regards to the registration, as I say, that's something that we can certainly assist you with. So if you want to find out more about that, please do get in touch from that respect. Um, I'm just trying to think of any other typical questions that really come up. But I guess other than things like the earnings, which we've covered, the GPs really are making three times, best part of three times, more of what a UK GP would be making.
Mm. Yeah.
That is factual. There is the ability of obviously earning more depending on the special interests and the out of hours work that you pick up at the same time. And that would impact obviously the working hours slightly, but as I say, a lot of GPs, they'll do that kind of 38 to 40 hours a week and they'll walk out the door.
Yeah.
They'll walk out the door not taking admin work home with them, not taking hours and hours worth of additional work and stress home with them. you
Going to
know
the beach, something like that.
Exactly. Going on a barbecue on the beach, for
Yeah.
example. Yeah, a lot of the admin work's done inside the consultations. The software systems that they've got, allows you to actually get your tasks done,
Mm.
there and then, which is great.
Excellent. Fantastic. Well, that's it, folks. As you've heard, overall, Australia has a lot of standouts, a lot of positives, and you can understand why it is so appealing to so many GPs. So, Thomas, have you got any closing remarks for our listeners?
Um, I guess, guys, if you want to hear anything else, please do get in touch. Our details will be below, so we'd love to obviously speak to you. And overall, Australia has got some awesome opportunities. We've got some great opportunities that we can kind of put you in touch with, give you that ability to speak to a few other GPs as well and other practices. Find out a little bit more about obviously what working there would be like, and if you want to discuss the how we can advance your career in Australia, as I keep saying, get in touch.
Absolutely. And also make sure that you stay tuned to all our social channels to listen up for more episodes in this series that Thomas is going to be heading up. So once again, just to remind people, the title of that is going to be Ticket to Oz, GP's Guide to Working and Living in Australia. So keep your eyes peeled for more on that. But for now, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening. And as I say, you can follow us on all of our social channels, pages as well: Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram, all of those. Thanks very much for joining me today, Thomas. I look forward to seeing how the rest of the series goes.
No, thank you very much for having me. Thank you
My
everyone for
pleasure.
listening as well.
My pleasure. And we will we'll be in touch.